Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our latest productivity talk, organized by the Asian Productivity Organization. This is Polchait Kraparyun, and I'm with the Public Sector Division of the APO. We are streaming live from Tokyo, Japan. Today's topic of discussion is one that is central to productivity, which of course is at the heart of APO's work. Economists agree that productivity is the key to long-term increases in people's standards of living. And innovation, of course, is core to increasing productivity for the long term. The subject of this talk will be centered around innovation, and specifically about one type of institution that can be a powerful tool for policymakers to promote innovation at the national level. The title of this talk is Driving Innovation, Public Research Institute Contributions. In this productivity talk, we have Professor Pattarapong, who will discuss his research results on the roles of public research institutes, or PRIs, in driving innovation by looking at the experience of these institutes in Germany, Australia, Japan, the US, and the Republic of China. To share his knowledge and views on this issue, we're honored to have Professor Pattarapong from Thailand, although currently he is based in Tokyo, speaking here today. I'd like to give a little bit of background on Professor Pattarapong. He's a full professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Tokyo. His research involves innovation systems in newly industrializing countries in Asia, industrial clusters, technological capabilities of latecomer firms, innovation financing, and roles of public research institutes and universities. He's an editor-in-chief of the SSCI-indexed Asian Journal of Technology Innovation, and is a member of international editorial boards of several international journals related to innovation management and policies. He's worked as an advisor and consultant for the World Bank, UNESCO, UNCTAD, the OECD, JICA, the German Development Institute, the International Development Research Center of Canada, the Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia, and of course with the APO as well. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Pattarapong. Before you begin, I'd like to note to the audience that today's session will be interactive. So if anyone who's currently watching would like to ask any questions or make any comments, please leave them in the live chat. Professor, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to share my view on public research in driving innovation with all of you. Actually, this is my research project that I have done for Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, in Japan. The background is Japan would like to change the role or reform public research institute to make sure that they contribute more to innovation in the private sector. So I was commissioned to study the roles of 5 leading public research institutes in the world and draw the lesson learned from Japan. So today I'm going to discuss about the role of public research institute in 5 leading countries in the world. But I know that most APO members are not advanced countries. Mostly they are developing countries. But the lesson learned from advanced country public research institute can shed some light on the operation of the public research institute in developing countries. So that's why I think this topic might be somehow useful for you. So I will start my presentation, and as I already explained, I want to look at the roles of public research institute in driving innovation. And the big question in advanced country is that firm in advanced country is already have high technological capabilities. Some of the firms have even more R&D budget and R&D personnel than one developing countries in comparison. So what else should be left for the roles of the firms in advanced country when many firms can conduct and finance R&D by themselves? That's a big question. Methodology-wise, I look at the role of public research institute in 5 leading countries, but the public research institute that I'm looking at is not every type of public research institute, but the only public research institute that having clear mission to help the industry. They set up in order to help the industry only. So that is a kind of criteria that I use to select the public research institute, and I look at 5 cases. All of these 5 cases are a kind of frontier level of public research institute. They are well known globally. So 5 leading public research institute one is the Fraunhofer in Germany, another is CSIRO in Australia, the National Institute of Standard and Technology, or NIST, in USA, and AIST in Japan, and ITRI in Taiwan. All of these cases are very well-known cases and have some lesson to learn. So today talk, I'm going to touch upon all these 5 leading research institutes, but mainly I pay more attention to the 2 public research institute. One is Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, which represent public research institute in developed countries, and ITRI, which represent public research institute in catching up country. Of course, Taiwan or People Republic of China, PRC, now is a developed country, but the role of ITRI is already significant when Taiwan was a developing country. So I think the role of ITRI is very interesting for other public research institutes in developing countries to learn. So I'm going to discuss about these 5 leading public research institutes, and the way I conducted this research is through the in-depth semi-structured interviews, which have been done for 2 years, from 2013 to 2016. So that is the main source of my information. So the basic fact of the public research institute, you can see that all of them has a long history. The latest one is ITRI in Taiwan. Is already have 50 years old history, and they are rather big. Their revenues is quite substantial, close to $1 billion, and they have a large number of employees. The smallest one would have something around 3,000 employees. So this public research institute is long established and is quite large in terms of revenues and employees. And if you look at the role of public research institute, their role of these 5 public research institutes, they are not static. They evolve over time. Especially they evolve accordingly to the change of the technological capability of the local firms and the level of economic development of the countries. So it evolves accordingly. For example, Fraunhofer Institute, they set up in order to satisfy the need of the industry. So they have the sole problem to solve, that is to solve the problem for the industry. So most of their activities is addressing to solve the problem of today's industry. Most of their budget, most of their fund is allocated to today's research. Only a small fund is allocated to long-term R&D. And this day, Fraunhofer Institute have customers not only in Germany or Europe, or even in developing countries, also in Asia like Japan, China, or even some ASEAN country like Thailand. So it's very much embracing internationalization. AIST in Japan was set up when Japan was a catching up country. At that time, Japan was behind the technological frontier, trying to catching up with the West. So AIST was set up to provide long-term research to create new industry at the time. So mission of AIST is very much focusing on creating new industry for Japan at the time. And in 1980s, Japan was pressurized by US to contribute more in terms of basic research because Japan was charged that they are like a free rider. So they just only rely on the technology and knowledge generated by the West. So Japan should contribute more. So under this pressure, AIST moved to do more basic research. But more recently, from the year 2000 onward, AIST, under the criticism that they should provide more practical research to do something more practical for the industry. So it swung back to do more practical research. So you can see that the role of public research in still is not static. It's moving back and forth. And sometimes political pressure is the one that force them to move their role, to change their roles. National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, this public research institute is under Department of Commerce in the US, and they have the very clear target to focusing on basic research on measurement and standard. So they do basic research, but basic research in order to develop industrial standard, technology standard, and make sure that US standard become a global standard. Whoever win the game of the standard will win the game of competition, right? So that is the contribution of National Institute of Standard and Technology. And also they have unrelated activities to support industry, especially small and medium enterprises across US. They are the manager of the manufacturing extension program. This manufacturing extension program have 400 centers around US, but they only manage them. They didn't operate those centers. So those centers is operated by contracted organization like university or even companies. So that is the role of NIST. And this activity is not related to the basic research on measurement and standard. So that's the role of NIST. The CSIRO in Australia is start from trying to do basic research for mining industry and later on agriculture industry. Later on is moved to manufacturing and high-tech industry. And at the beginning, is trying to only focus on basic research, but under the pressure, they have to do more innovation type of research, research that closely related more to the industry. They're trying to move to become the innovation catalyst for Australia, but they are still struggling because innovation catalyst role is not successful yet. Many of the scientists and researchers inside the CSIRO is still against moving from basic research to more applied and development type of research. ITRI in Taiwan is very interesting. As I said, Taiwan or Republic of China is used to be a developing countries, right? And when the Taiwan was developing country, it had to rely on a lot of foreign technologies. So ITRI at the beginning is trying to import foreign technology and try to make sure that they understand that technology and apply them to the local condition in Taiwan. And later on, they transfer the technology to Taiwan SMEs or set up the spin-off company. So the role of ITRI is moving according to the level of development of Taiwan. This one I will elaborate later on. And ITRI is always focusing on small and medium enterprises. And when Taiwan NIST company became larger and they are more R&D intensive, ITRI also adjusted their role to focus on doing next generation technologies, which is too risky or out of scope of existing firm, even the large firm. So they found their own new role and even work with the large firm in order to develop the next generation technology. This is what I call it co-evolution, because role is evolved over time. When economic development of the country change, the role of ITER also change accordingly as well. So if we look at a very important aspect, which is the funding sources, you can see that the Fraunhofer Institute, only 1/3 of their income is coming from block grant from the government. 2/3 is either from competitive grant or from the industry. So only 1/3. If you look at many developing country public research institute, most of their income, maybe 90 or 80% of their income, is coming from block grant from the government. And that is not the case in Fraunhofer Institute. CSIRO in Australia, the income from industry is less than 20%. You still have to rely on the block grant from the government, the same as AIST, even though AIST have a kind of target trying to double income from industry, and they have achieved that. So they are trying to move to rely more on the income from the industry. That's a direction, because relying more on income from industry is mean that you answer to the need of industry more. And National Institute of Standards and Technology, there's no target on income from industry, because most of their research is basic research in order to develop the industrial standard and make sure that US standard become the global standard. ITRI in Taiwan, all of the ITRI budget is coming either from competitive grant or the private sector. There's no block grant at all. All the budget, even from the government, they have to compete with other organizations like other public research institute, university, or companies. So that is the role of ITRI. Government only provide budget project by project, and they have to compete. And the rest, they have to earn from the industry. And another interesting characteristic is about the mode of interaction with the industry. Many people, especially in developing countries who run the public research institute, view that licensing is the most important mode of interaction. You have to develop your technology or knowledge first, and then develop the product, and then register the patent, and then license out to the private companies. That's the licensing mode, which is not the main mode for this more successful public research institute. Instead, contract research is much more important. Actually, it's the most important mode of interaction with the industry. So the industry contract public research institute and ask them and pay for their research. So this is contract research. So contract research is the most important one. It's followed by R&D consortium. R&D consortium is a consortium that public research institute act as an intermediary or broker, getting private companies to join the R&D project. And then they do R&D together, and each company later on will develop their own branded product based on the prototype that developed by the consortium. So R&D consortium is very popular in Japan and followed by US and also in Taiwan. That's another significant mode of interaction with the industry. And then it's followed by, for example, like spin-off. Spin-off is very popular in Taiwan since 1970s. So spin-off, the kind of the public research institute researcher move out and set up their own companies, and in order to carry on the research and develop the product and market. So that helped Taiwan to become the leaders in semiconductor industry. Also, very important mode of interaction is people mobility. Mobility from public research institute to industry, and also vice versa. So that people mobility is the best mode of technology transfer. Is informal mode, but it's very important in terms of technology transfer. So mobility is another important mode of interaction. So you can see that licensing is not that important compared to other modes. And if you look at the ITRI role, I think as I said, I want to elaborate more in the role of ITRI in Taiwan. You can see that in 1970s or 1980s, a firm in Taiwan is lack of design engineering ability and even weak in basic operation capabilities. So the role of ITRI at that time is not doing their own research, but to acquire foreign technology, license in foreign technology, and carrying out R&D, not to develop their own product, but to understand, assimilate, and adapt for imported technology. And then they just set up the new companies through spin off. Because they cannot transfer this technology to local SME. Local SME doesn't have absorptive capacity to get the technology transfer. The only way to develop the industry is to do the spin-off. So they spin off a company which became the world leading semiconductor company like UMC or TSMC. That happened since 1970 or early 80s. And from early 80s to 1990s, you can see that many of Taiwanese companies develop design engineering capabilities. So design engineering is the key of the technological capability at that time. So how ITRI can contribute? They can contribute by set up intermediary, and intermediary is running R&D consortium with the local firms. So the consortium conduct joint research leading to prototypes which were subsequently developed further to be commercially product by each participating firms. So R&D consortium is used to develop well-known product of today, like notebook producer by Taiwanese company like Acer, Asus. Is a kind of the product of the R&D consortium that ITRI managed as an intermediary. In 1990s to the present, many Taiwanese companies already attained R&D capabilities, and they are trying to develop the new business through the startup, the new technology-based startup. So the role of ITRI also changed accordingly, because now they want to help Taiwanese firms develop R&D capabilities and R&D management. Right. So also encouraging the startup. So they adopt the new measure called opening lab. They open the ITRI lab for SMEs to participate and learn from the ITRI researcher. They work side by side, and also they develop the incubator to nurture the startup. So you can see that when the technology capability of the local firm change, the need is change, then the role of ITRI also change accordingly as well. Ability to adjust yourself according to the change of the need of the private sector is the key factor to say whether public research still is successful or not. So if you look at the key factors influencing success and failure of public research institute, you can see that there are several factors that matters a lot and contribute to success or failure. One is funding, where the funding should come from. If all the funding from the government as block grant, the public research institute get the blank check from the government every year, then they don't need to do anything. They don't need to serve the private sector actively. So the rule of thumb is that 1/3 should come from block grant from the government to fund the institutional expenses like human resources, like wage of researcher or R&D equipment. But the rest should come from either competitive grant or coming from the industry. If you look at the Fraunhofer Institute, you can see that this 1/3 rule is applied. 1/3 from the block grant from the government, which cover, as I said, the normal routine expenditure, and 1/3 from competitive grant, either from Germany government or from EU government or from other sources. But you have to compete in order to get the grant. And 1/3 is from the industry. That is the important. And every project should be good enough to get 2/3 outside Fraunhofer. If you cannot get 2/3 outside the Fraunhofer, project cannot start. So this is the criteria from the starting the project. And the research unit that get more external income will be allocated more basic fund as an incentive. That is the Fraunhofer way of getting the budget. Another important aspect is where the researcher should come from. Should there be tenure or permanent researcher or limited term contract? I think there are pros and cons. If you have the tenure or permanent researchers, then you can have stability. You can carry out longer term research. You can deepen your knowledge at the organizational level. But if all of your staff they are permanent, then there's no change at all. So you need new brain, new idea, which coming from outside. So limited term contract, if they apply to a certain extent, it can provide a new idea, can stimulate the organization. So the balance between the two is depending on the mission of public research institute. If they want to do more longer term research, then maybe the tenure or permanent staff is necessary. But if the pace of change of the technology and industry sector is very fast, then maybe you need more and more new idea, right? So it depends on the situation of public research institute. And another issue is about mobility of researchers to and from the industry. As I said, is the important source of technology transfer and building trust and contact with the industry. And Fraunhofer is very clear in this sense. Fraunhofer acts as intermediary, is bridging between firm and university. Most of Fraunhofer R&D institute, they are located inside university. So instead of setting their own separated laboratories, they are setting laboratory or R&D institute inside university. So director of this research institute under Fraunhofer mostly have the title of professor, and so most of them coming from university, but a few of them also, of course, coming from industry and later appointed as professor. So that is the idea, to leverage university and make sure that university can work with industry. So Fraunhofer act as a bridge between firms and university. And interestingly, undergraduate students in working in this laboratory, they start as a research assistant and continue working during their master degree and PhD or postdoctoral research. And after graduation, they can still work at Fraunhofer for 3 and 5 years under limited contract. After that, they have to move to the industry. So Fraunhofer is like a school developing the researcher and scientists, engineers for an industry, and link this through this human link. They have a very good contacts with the industry for further collaborative research. ITRI is very similar. Human resource mobility is a key of informal mode of interaction. So far, almost 2,500 ITRI employees left ITRI and brought their talent into industry in the field. So this is the best technology transfer to human resource mobility. And some of them even came back and forth a few times between ITRI and industry. Every time they came back to ITRI, they get promotion because they have more knowledge and contacts. And ITRI is located inside a Hsinchu site-based industrial park. So around ITRI, there are many companies that work closely with ITRI. So this kind of face-to-face interaction help ITRI to develop collaborative research with the companies in the science park. So this is the way that mobility of researchers help in terms of technology transfer and build up the collaborative research. Another important issue is how you set up research agenda. Research agenda should set up by the researcher themselves, or it should purely set up by the customer, which is the industry. That is debatable. I think from the study, it's very obvious that any new project should be good enough to be largely funded by external financial sources. So if the project is not good enough, then it cannot attract external financial sources. So the project should not start at all. That is the very clear criteria of setting a research agenda adopted by Fraunhofer or ITRI, and to a lesser extent, other public research institutes. But also there's a need to do research on industry next generation or prospectively disruptive technology, because most of the industry is preoccupied with today's problem. Most of their R&D is focusing on today's problem, today's solution. Even big company like Panasonic or Sony, which I interview, 90% of their R&D budget and time is spent on today's problems, today's product, developing the future product, especially based on totally new technology, or so-called disruptive technology, is minor compared to today's problem. But they want to collaborate with public research institute on this new or next generation topic. So there's a room for public research institute to work even with the large company, even with multinational corporation, to develop the next generation disruptive technology. E3 is very clear in showing this example. Half the E3 income is coming from short-term or medium-term demand to solve today's problem for industry. Mostly they work for SMEs. But the other half is coming from either long-term research to develop core technology for the future, or exploratory and risky project aiming to develop new industry with large firm and startup. So E3 is doing half and half. Half is for today's problem, working with SME. Another half with big company to develop the new industry, to do more exploratory, risky projects. And how to measure the performance is a big issue. Everywhere we ask for how to measure the performance. And counting quantity, like counting number of publication or patents that developed by public research institute, is a kind of less popular now, because it's not less effective. Many patents or many publications fail to be commercialized, fail to make a real change, especially contribution to the companies. So the trend is to move from counting the number to overall impact assessment. How much government spend in public research institute, and how much impact they can be created. That is the key to the performance. But it's not easy to exercise. The bottom line for me is to evaluate performance is whether a large part of their income come from industry and competitive grant. If the large part of income from competitive grant and industry, it means they answer to external demand, they answer to the customer. That's the best indicator to show their performance. They should be good enough for other people to pay for them. So another issue is that the distance is matters. So Taiwan company is doing a lot of the spin-off around E3 campus in Hsinchu Side-Based Industrial Park, is allowing them to maintain close contact and encourage mobility of the people. And there's a co-location concept of Fraunhofer and CSIRO as well. So that's the best way to interact with the industry. That's the best way to interact with the industry, is that you cannot just operate from the capital or big city. You need to closely work with local firms in different locality in the country. And when you work with the local firm, sometimes you work with the local university as well. So you have several branch office around the country. Or in case of Fraunhofer, they have public research institute inside university, and they work with the local company. And they use the concept called the co-location. Co-location is mean that public research institute, university, and laboratories of large company, they're co-located in the same geographical location. They can just have face-to-face meeting easily. Sometimes there's no fence at all. You can just walk across these three type of agency and meet regularly. For example, Fraunhofer Institute of Integrated System and Device Technology is co-located with University of Erlangen and Siemens R&D lab. So they're doing a lot of electronic research. Another institute is located in Stuttgart, which is the hub of automotive companies in Germany. So this Fraunhofer Institute for Manufacturing, Engineering, and Automation is located with University of Stuttgart and R&D lab of giant automotive firms like Volkswagen, for example. So this is the way you have to be co-located face-to-face interaction is still very important, even in the day of online networking, because you need to build trust and you need to have a lot of knowledge transfer, which require a face-to-face dialogue. And the governance, who should govern and how public research institutions should be governed. Many of these public research institutes, they have industry people in the board, and even in management team. The president of CSIRO in Australia came from the venture capital industry. The president of the AIST in Japan came from large company in Japan. So that is to make sure that public research institute know about the demand of the industry and become industrial relevant. And also another issue is is relationship with economic ministry. All of these public research institutes, they are not under Ministry of Science and Technology, because Ministry of Science and Technology is too far from the industry. All of them under economic ministry, like NIST in US is under Department of Commerce, AIST is under METI in Japan, the ITRI is under Ministry of Economic Affairs in Taiwan, which is more like equivalent to Ministry of Industry. Right? So that is to make sure that public research institute is an arm in the industrial policy or industrial technology policy arm of economic ministry. So when they deploy the industrial policy, they have the supporting organization to make sure that policy can be deployed effectively. So that is very important in terms of governance. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the public research institute have different roles and mode of interaction with industry, and ability to change their role according to the stage of development of the country or level of capability of local firms is one of the most criteria to judge whether public research institute is successful or not. And more interactive mode of collaboration between public research institute and firm, contract research and spin-off, and R&D consortium, and more effective than what we believe, like linear model, like licensing. Many people think that public research institute is not effective because they rely on licensing, but other models are much more effective but require more interaction in terms of collaboration with the firm. Geographical location, geography matters. So National Public Research Institute have to work effectively with local company in nearby or surrounding area, and sometimes with local university as well. Mobility of researcher and engineer to facilitate knowledge change is very important. We look at many public research institutes in developing countries. Mobility is very low. People want to work until day one, until they retire in public research institute. There's no encouragement for these people to live and coming back. So there's no facilitation of knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer. So they need to change their mindset in order to make better collaboration with the private sector. And not only in a public research institute should be viewed as knowledge creator. Successful public research institute act as intermediary. They're getting local company to work together with the local university to develop the prototype. And that is important, as shown in the case of R&D consortium in Taiwan, in the US, also in Japan. And thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it's somehow useful for you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pattarapong. So I think now we'll move to question and answers. Of course, if anyone watching would like to pose their own question, I've prepared some questions myself based on your presentation and, of course, the papers you've shared with us. So I think one of the first things which you addressed before you started was the idea that this particular research of yours focused on public research institutes in advanced countries. So, of course, you said something to the effect that I think the lessons from these public research institutes are still relevant to developing countries. Would you say that there is anything about PRIs that actually differ when we're talking about countries that have not yet they're still in the process of developing and maturing their industrial capabilities?
I think the lesson learned from this public research is still applicable to developing countries because many of them they were set up when the country is still the developing countries, like AIST in Japan or E3 in Taiwan. But the the thing is that many of public research is still in developing country is set up to model public research still in advanced country without acknowledging their history. So they look at the activity of what public research still in advanced country is doing now and trying to imitate them. So many of public research still in advanced country doing very advanced basic research. But in the past, AIST and Taiwan, in Japan and in AIST in Japan and E3 in Taiwan, at the time when the country is still developing country, they do something differently. Like in case of Taiwan, instead of doing their own research, they license in foreign technology and trying to understand and localize this technology and later on spinning off. So what E3 is doing in the past is very different from activity of public research in many developing countries of today. So that's why they are different result, different in terms of impact to the industry because they do things differently.
Right. So you're saying that maybe it's more appropriate for those who are involved in or setting up public research institutes in the developing world to look at the history, what the historical roles of PRIs that are kind of world famous now, for example, ITRI, as you mentioned, what they were doing maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So
Yeah, that's right.
was it the case that, for example, ITRI or Fraunhofer, they were still engaged mainly, because you said that maybe a good measure of PRI performance was contract research. Were they still heavily, because if you were, I'm just thinking that if you are a PRI and you're still sort of setting up your capability, maybe you don't have as much of a reputation. Is it still easy to find contract research? Will you still be able to meet demand, or will there be a demand?
Yeah, demand is still very huge because for E3, for example, half of their customer, actually most of their customer and half of their income is coming from small and medium enterprises. And small and medium enterprise, mostly in any country, comprise 90% of number of total enterprises. So always there's a demand from the industry, and even large company also want to work with public research institute to develop next generation technology because they are preoccupied with today's or current generation of technology. So this kind of disruptive technology is in the sideline of the company, but this is still important. So they prefer to work with public research institute or university. So there are room for collaboration. And if they're doing more and more successful, then they build up their reputation. So the Fraunhofer brand and E3 brand is a global brand now. So many companies, including foreign companies, want to work with them.
Right. That makes sense. I think a previous paper of yours from 2011, the one that looks at Model A and Model B public research institutes in late industrializing countries, I believe it might be relevant here, relevant for people who are coming from the developing world. Could you share a little bit about your work there?
Okay. Thank you. In that previous paper, I look at the two different models of public research still in developing country. One is ITRI, another one is the public research still in Thailand, like is NASDA, National Science Technology Development Agency. It's quite clear that they operate in the different model. While NASDA is belong to Ministry of Science Technology, ITRI is under Ministry of Economic Affairs. While most of NASDA executive, they are from university or they just researcher at NASDA and moving up the ladder most of the E3 executive, they have industry experience. Many of them work in the US before, and they also rely on middle management or the head of research unit that have the industry experience as well, not only top executive. So E3 is the mobility of the people is much more fluid, and they receive not only researcher but also middle management or even top management from industry. People are going out all the time, and they encourage people to go out. And every time they come back, they get higher position and higher salary. So that is incentive. So the way of thinking is very different from the rest of public research in still in the industry. And the important criteria for E3 is to earn income from the industry, and that is not the case in many developing countries because they still rely on the government. Even some of the public research is still in developing countries lately trying to earn from the industry, but they don't have the clear mechanism like in contract research or R&D consortium. It's not very much applied in the rest of developing countries. There are many of public research in still in developing countries don't know how to be an intermediary or manager of R&D consortium. So they lack very important mode of interaction. So that is the case. And then many of them is still counting patents or publication as an indicator for their performance, while E3 and Fraunhofer is counting the contribution from the industry and use them as the criteria for their performance or even starting the project.
Right.
So that's a big difference between the E3 as an exception and the rest of public research is still in developing world.
Right. So I think that touches on two ideas that I'd like to get more into. First, the role of people and employment policy in public research institutes, and also, like you mentioned, performance evaluation, the idea of metrics. But first, I'd like to address a question from one of the viewers. So they're asking, what is the way or mechanism, in your view, Professor, for developing countries to close the gap between university and industry in terms of R&D and innovation? So I think maybe in the developing countries, sometimes firms are leaders in R&D, and also possibly in developing countries, sometimes the university is quite far ahead. So what is the mechanism or best mechanism for closing this gap?
I think the problem of university and industry collaboration is problem almost everywhere, including developed countries like Japan, because the university is not set up in order to help the industry from the beginning. But public research institute that I mentioned in these 5 countries, their main mission is to help the industry. The role of the university is to teach, and the second role is to do basic research, frontier research. The third role, which is the latest role, is to help the enterprise. But that is the third role. It's not the first 2 major roles. So always there are problems. And in case of Taiwan and Germany, it's quite clear that the public research is helped to act as a bridge between university and companies. So you need people who understand both and make them to work together. You need the intermediary or need the go-between. That is very important. And that is the role of public research institute as well. It's not only to do research. Intermediary role is really substantial. Right? So that will help to facilitate better university and industry collaboration.
So I think that, I think that was one of the most interesting takeaways from your research paper, the idea of PRIs being a necessary intermediary between industry and academia, or between more advanced firms and less advanced firms. I'm wondering, I think there was a bit in your paper in which you wrote that one of the reasons why this role is more important is because innovation is more open today, and also that there is maybe more opportunities for what you described as systemic or network failures. Do you think you could expand on this? What is it about how innovation is done today that means that PRIs are increasingly important in this particular kind of role?
Yeah, as innovation is becoming more open in a sense that no one can innovate alone. You need to leverage other people, resources, idea, and capability. But uh, having said that, absorptive capacity is very, very critical. Many firms in developing countries lack absorptive capacity in, to develop the collaboration with external partners like foreign companies or university or even public research institute. So the role of public research institute is to help firms to increase their absorptive capacity, but most of public research institute in developing countries don't do this kind of job. They are trying to do more like frontier knowledge. They imitate public research institute in advanced country. If advanced country want to do IT technology, they have IT center. If advanced country want to do nanotechnology, they have nanotechnology center. If advanced country want to go for energy technology, they set up energy center. That is the mimicking attitude. You never achieve anything like that because you don't understand your own local company with lack absorptive capacity. So ITRI, instead of doing this advanced research, when Taiwan was a developing country, they're trying to enhance basic operation capability of the firm. They provide some training, they provide some even spin-off, or they provide kind of engineering and design capability. It's not R&D capability that most of the SME want. SME want to get things done at operational level. SME want to develop their product to better engineering capability and be able to design the product. Many of them don't have R&D laboratories. There's no need for them to do R&D. Right? They rely on the foreign technology or imported machinery, but they want to operate them more effectively. That should be the role of public research in developing countries. It's not trying to mimic advanced country activity and doing very fancy type of technology, which is irrelevant to 90% of your local SMEs. So that is the mismatch between the mission of public research institute and the need of the industry. So that you should change your role in order to make sure that you act as intermediary. You need to enhance the absorptive capacity of the industry, especially SME first, and that is should be your prime mission.
Right. Thank you, Professor. One of the aspects you mentioned just there in your answer centered around the idea of people, and I think many of the points you made centered around the idea of how important it is the people that are involved in these public research institutes, the mobility of these people. I'm wondering, since in your research you've conducted many interviews, so I assume you've talked to many people who are involved in PRIs. I'm wondering, what is PRIs have a sort of unique position. They're not quite formal academia. It's not quite private sector research. Would you say that employees who work in these PRIs, do they have a unique professional identity? And what attracts personnel to these institutes when, of course, other options are always available? How do public research institutes attract the human resources that are needed?
I think one of the most attraction is do you do a challenging type of research. You do the research that have impact to the industry, and accordingly, you earn the extra income. For example, if you do a contract research, I mean, and it have the leading to a satisfactory result, so you earn extra income on top of your salary. Your bonus will increase, and if you develop the intellectual property right, then you partially earn substantial income generated from that intellectual property right as well. And then in the more successful public research institute, you have a chance to move out and coming back. So every time you come back, you earn a higher salary. So that is an attraction. So it's not like you have to stay on forever. You can get experience somewhere else a few years. You can come back. So it's interesting life. It's not like you have to work in one organization from day one until you retire. So most of the successful public research institute have this open door policy that is very attractive in order to make sure that their personnel have the exciting the research life as well as the challenges, and it's not boring enough to work within one organization. Mhm.
And I guess I wonder, considering the mobility of researchers from the PRI to outside the PRI is so critical, and you also mentioned the limitations of maybe some of the current metrics that are used to measure innovation, for example, patents or patent licensing. What would you say are, would you say, one, do the current metrics or the current ways that we evaluate how PRIs work, at least for the ones you mentioned, do they paint an accurate picture of their performance? How can they be improved? What metrics do you think we should focus on? I know you mentioned one, the amount of contract research, but I'm wondering if, because innovation is a very difficult thing to really capture, and the value of these institutes are difficult to capture because sometimes their effects are so indirect or long term. So in your mind, what do you think are better metrics or a better set of metrics?
As I said that, and also you acknowledge, it's very difficult to assess the contribution of PIs, but not an easy way out to just count the number of patents or publication. That is not a good indicator. If you apply the bad indicator, then your organization will operate in the wrong direction. So this day they are trying to rely on the economic impact assessment. So economic impact assessment is to look at how much is $1 you spend on public research institute and how much this $1 generate. It's not immediate effect. It may be 5 years, 10 years. In Japan or in other countries, they have this kind of the follow-up evaluation. Is after the project finish 5-10 years, what is down the line, and that is very important. And but to make sure that this thing happen fairly, the public research institute should not be the one who hire external party to evaluate themselves. This evaluation have to be done by the third party, like by the ministry that supervise the public research institute. But public research institute should not be the one who pay for the or commission this kind of evaluation. And another one is to have the qualitative case studies, whether the public research institute can develop the new product that lead to emergence of new industry or change in the position of the country in global value chain. If you can have a lot of case studies of new products or new process or new business model that develop as a result of the work of public research institute, this kind of qualitative stories can also tell about effectiveness in terms of role of public research institute as well. But these two maybe is difficult to evaluate. That's why I think the easiest way to do is to look at how much the income they can generate from industry as a percentage of total income. Has it increased over time? I think that should be something that you should look at. That easiest way.
I'd like to change tracks for a moment and talk maybe a bit more about a general issue that I think many countries are facing or the world is facing in terms of innovation. So you might already be familiar with this, Professor, but there's a growing strain of literature that focuses on the idea that innovation is slowing or that it's getting more difficult to innovate. So I know Nicholas Bloom, professor of economics from Stanford, found that actually research productivity has been declining. So he looks at research inputs like R&D spending, number of researchers, and then he looks at certain outputs like progress in terms of semiconductors, agricultural crop yields, pharmaceutical innovation. And he finds that research productivity is declining. So I think there are two kind of general explanations for this. So I'll talk about the first one first. One explanation is something that you mentioned earlier, that the amount of knowledge needed to make an innovation has sort of increased over time. So maybe there's a greater amount of need for specialization among researchers, and also the amount of training time that researchers require seems to have increased in recent years. Do you think public research institutes have a role to play in terms of the human capital development for researchers if innovation is more difficult now today?
I think this is a very good question. As you see that from experience of ITRI and Fraunhofer Institute that I show you, you can see that a lot of their researchers or engineers or scientists left their organization and work with the industry later on. That is the best training school. This is the best technology transfer because a lot of technology or knowledge is embedded in human being. So transferring human being is the transferring of technology effectively. That is the best way to prepare human resources for the industry. So that is another important mission of public research institute. So in this way, public research institute should not look at that if they lose the competent people, they lose their capability. But they should look at it as the contribution to the society at large or to the industry in particular. Right? So that is the best way. If you have this kind of program, like in case of Germany, Fraunhofer, you only can work 3 or 5 years after you get PhD. After that, you have to go out. You have to move because it's fixed term contract, and that is the best way to be like a school or training of researcher, young researcher for the industry. That's the best way.
So the second explanation for the trend I talked about, the decline in research productivity, some scholars identify it attribute it to the fact that a greater share of R&D spending now is on applied or practical research rather than basic science. So, and also connects it to the trend that there's a growing division of labor between academic research and private sector research. So do you think it seems like public research institutes have been affected by this trend? Do you think this focus on applied research is better maybe over the longer term in promoting innovation? I think about some of the institutes that aren't directly connected to promoting industry. For example, you think of kind of defense-related industries or NASA, for example. They sort of innovate in a way that's not directly connected to industrial need, but many of their innovations have big spillover effects. Some of our most transformative technologies have first been developed in military or in space, for example, and then later they trickle down to the rest of the economy. So do you think, what do you think about this trend?
I think in general, if you look at advanced countries, they have division of responsibility between basic research, basic research institute, and public research institute that focusing on the industry. For example, like in Germany, you have Max Planck and you have Fraunhofer. In Taiwan, you have Sinica, right? You have doing basic research, and you have ITRI doing more applied and development research, and they are used to be under different ministries before, right? So that's the case. So you need division of responsibility. Both are quite important in advanced country because basic research provide option or diversity which private sector and industry can reap the benefit in the future. Without this kind of diversity of knowledge, new knowledge, you cannot create a new product, right? But at the same time, you have to be able to exploit this knowledge. So public research is still that aim to help the industry is doing this activity. So it's trying to help the company to exploit knowledge that already developed. So you need a balance. But in developing country, they have a different balance because most of the technology and knowledge in developing country, they are imported technology, either through licensing or through importing machinery. So the more important for developing country is to exploit the technology that already developed somewhere else and that requires absorptive capacity to understand, to upgrade, and to localize those technology. So the role of PRI should focusing on this in case of developing country. So it is different when we talk about this kind of context from developed and developing country. They are different. So because the way the innovation happen in two contexts are different. Right? The innovation in advanced country may need more new knowledge from the basic research. But in developing country, a lot of innovation, especially something that new to the firm, not new to the world, new for themselves, is relying on knowledge that already created somewhere else, right? So that is the nature of innovation in the two contexts are different. So the role of public research institute should be different accordingly as well.
So to return back to one of the earlier questions I asked you, which was about the role of PRIs specifically in the developing world, I'd like to talk about governance. So I think the OECD, when looking at public research institutes, noted that recently they've tried to adopt more business-like operational models to engage in more public-private partnerships, and also to be increasingly open and responsive to the market. So these are trends you've also highlighted, and in many ways you've noted these are kind of key success factors. I'm wondering, are these, considering you've noted that public research institutes in the developing world should look at the historical models that were employed in places like Germany and the Republic of China, would it be better for people, for example, setting up a PRI now to be trying to do these kind of more network or business-like models of running their institution, or should they adopt maybe the more traditional models that existed in the past?
I think this also go back to my original idea that you need division of responsibility between public research institute that do more basic research to generate new knowledge, and the public research institute that trying to help the industry. In many European countries, you have public research institute that doing both in one organization. So you end up being a jack of all trades but master of none. You have so many things to take over. You have so many targets. You have too many stakeholders. You think you want to answer everything. You want to be national agency, but you end up being nothing because you have too many customers. So that is the most critical one. You need division of responsibility. You need better organizational set up. You need division of responsibility. I think that's the way I want to address this question. So if you want to do both, you fail.
We focus most of our conversation on PRIs, but of course I know that your work involves many other kinds of innovation and science policy in general. So maybe outside of PRIs, what are other policies or mechanisms that decision makers should have in their maybe quote unquote toolkit for promoting innovation? So what else are important elements of a national innovation system?
I think
that maybe our viewers should be aware of. Yeah.
Okay, I think that if you want to formulate the effective policy, firm should be the center of the policy. So you need to understand how innovation happens in the firm, and policy should be able to speed up this innovation process inside the firm. If policy cannot do that, then you are either relevant or ineffective. So that is what I want to say. So you need to understand innovation process. You need to know what kind of capabilities that they need, and they need to set up the policy, and including like University of Public Research Institute as an execution bodies of policy to address this kind of capability. So that is the most important thing. Most of the policy in developing countries fail to address that, because they like to look at the indicators that they popular in advanced country. For example, R&D expenditure as percentage of GDP. That is the very easiest indicator. So the more you invest in R&D, the better the country is. But that is not true because as I said, most of the local SME, they don't have the R&D capacity and they don't need to do R&D. They need to increase their productivity first to get the operation right, to acquire engineering and design capability. And those capability very important for them to innovate, to have a better production process, to develop new product, which is new to themselves, not new to the market or new to the firm. So innovation concept for many developing country firm is this due to the firm concept. So in this case, that is the policy should focusing on this rather than trying to increase the R&D expenditure in government agencies, in university. So most of the budget should be financed to the innovation inside the firm. In many developing countries, most of the budget is went to government agency, public research is still doing more basic research, and also university. That is the norm in many developing countries, and that is misleading. So your science, technology, innovation policy is not firm center science, technology, innovation policy, and that should be changed.
I think you might have touched on this question already, but I'll ask in case you have another view on this with the answer you just made right now. What do you think are the most common misconceptions that lay people or even policymakers make? What kind of common misconceptions do they have when thinking about innovation and promoting innovation in a national or sectoral context?
It's one of the most common perception is about R&D. They think that R&D is equivalent to science, technology, innovation capability, and the R&D is the most important target for science, technology policy. So they lack understanding of innovation process in most of the SME, especially in developing countries. That I already said, the other capability like design, engineering, or even operational capability are very, very important. So there's mismatch between the policy which focusing on R&D and the reality in the industry. That's the first one. The second one is that many of the policy instruments are very limited in developing countries. Mainly, they are using a lot of tax incentive, or they're building up infrastructure. They train engineers, scientists, or they create the science park incubators, but they don't have the policy instrument like subsidy or grants or co-investment on company. So they don't lack of this kind of financial incentive. So they're just relying on the tax incentive, which is a blunt instrument because the firm want to get their income. They want to get the money now in order to reduce the risk and uncertainty. They don't want to get the money when their product already reached the market and became successful. They don't. Of course, it's good to pay less tax. They need more the money now, right? So the grant, matching grant from the government or subsidy, which is used extensively in case of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, is not the case in many developing countries. The government is very reluctant to provide grant to the company. Most of the grant is going to public research institute or to university. That's the second misconception. The third misconception is that they think that when they want to develop the local industry, they're only looking at the local SMEs. They don't look at public. They don't look at the multinational companies. Multinational companies are very important, but you need to make sure that they transfer technology or work closely with the local SME, and then they should upgrade their capability inside the country from just using the country for operation purpose to do more advanced capability in the country like R&D or advanced engineering. So the policy should target on those two, make sure that they collaborate with the local firm and make sure that do something more advanced technology inside the country. So that should be the target. But most of the developing countries investment policy only attract them to invest in setting up factory, and that's all. So there's no incentive for them to transfer technology and no pressure for them either to do that. No pressure for them to upgrade their capability inside. So countries like Singapore or even Taiwan, they have incentive for this company to upgrade their capability locally and to work with a local company. If you work with a local company, you get subsidy. If you work with a local company, you get more tax incentive. If you work with a local company, you can get more human resources or even land. Or if you work with the university, the local university government is going to organize a research institute inside university for you, something like that. So that is the another misconception. So in many developing countries, government policy have to be more effective and more instrumental and must be more hand-on in order to get multinational corporation to work in your country. It's not good enough just to complain that they are not transfer technology. They are not charitable organization. They only be manipulated by incentive and pressure. So you need to do that right. And there's already example of the country that doing it right, like in case of Singapore, Taiwan, and to a large extent, like in even China, for example. Right. So I don't have time to go on this, but I think that's another misconception.
Right. I think we're going a bit past our hour now, so I will just have one final question. So for people who are interested in learning more about national innovation systems or public research institutes, what resources, people, or organizations would you point them towards if they wanted to learn more?
I think this day there are many online courses available and also many meetings or academic seminar is already available free online and they can join those kind of seminars as well. For example, in Asia, we have Asia Links, which is the network of scholar and innovation practitioner, including policymakers. And we discussed issue concerning Asia innovation and technology capability every year. So this year we could not organize it because of COVID, but it will be in Jakarta, Indonesia, next year or probably next July, and we have the kind of online conference program and also output as well. I think that the same apply for other conferences.
Great. So I think 1 hour has passed. I'd like to thank our viewers for their engagement and for being involved in this session. If you leave your comments under the video on YouTube, for example, suggestions on future topics that the APO could tackle, please let us know. I'd like to thank Professor Pattarapong for sharing his time and knowledge with us. I think you've given us a lot of interesting things to think about and important insights about innovation. With all this thinking about innovation policy, we at the APO hope to continue working with our member governments in considering all the potential means for supporting their continued development and well-being. So again, thank you, Professor Pattarapong, for giving us your time today. And thank you also to the viewers. We look forward to seeing you at our next productivity talk. To get updated, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I hope everyone stays safe, happy, and productive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.